Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the U.S.-China trade war. We haven't discussed that in a while, but a recent report has come out by the New York Fed that has estimated that the trade war has cost American firms $1.7 trillion in market value, i.e. $1.7 trillion has been erased from the market value of American firms since the trade war began in 2018. The aim seems to have been the complete opposite, wasn't it, when it comes to Donald Trump's aim to protect American companies from what he has always called unfair advantage taken by China. At the same time, of course, we have greater details coming out about exactly the kind of percentage points slashed by the end of 2019, as well as the projected slash of percentage points in investment growth in the U.S. by the end of this year as well. And none of that, of course, is looking very good for the U.S. Certainly, China's economy has also been affected, so it's not like it's just a one-sided affair. However, has Donald Trump in some ways failed in his goal when it comes to this trade war to begin with? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Tugrul, Keskin, who is a professor and director of the Center for Global Governance at Shanghai University. He is joining us now from Istanbul. Joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning is Don Giolzetti, who is a political analyst, policy analyst, I should say. Don and Tugrul, thank you both for your time today. Don, let me start with you. What do you make of these figures? Certainly none of it looks good for the U.S. at this time.
Yeah, with this recent report coming out from the New York Fed, it certainly just goes to show that right now, tariffs since 2018 have really affected U.S. companies, particularly the agriculture industry, who's been hit hardest. And in terms of the investment numbers, yeah, those are pretty staggering too, based on the report itself. So there's less money coming in, there's less investment, and the fact that the tariffs that are in place, they do create market uncertainty, which is never good for investment. That said, I think when we look at tariffs, we also have to look at it from a political and geopolitical standpoint or viewpoint, because that's how the Trump administration looks at these tariffs. They see tariffs as not just a blunt object or tool to basically make sure that Chinese imports are coming in are going to be tariffed or taxed, but they also look at it as, look, the Trump administration has a long-term strategy, which is you could say, pseudo-decoupling. And the tariffs help to basically make sure or have U.S. companies move their manufacturing, move their operations to the U.S. or to other countries. So that's one aspect of it. You could also look at the tariffs as the fact that the U.S. is putting a pressure campaign on China. So we have to look at it politically. Now, we know that tariffs, they hurt the country that is implementing them because they're a tax on the company or the consumer. But I think what the Trump administration is looking at is that this is going to be short-term pain for long-term gain. And that is, we're seeing that with members, so U.S. companies who are operating in China. We see that based on surveys right now. They believe that overall they're taking a wait-and-see approach to see if the tariffs were worth it. So most do not approve of the tariffs. Yeah. But if they can get some sort of something back in return in terms of better market access or forced tech transfer protection, IPR protection, et cetera, then they might believe it to be worth it. So we have to see in the end whether it will be worth it. But for now, certainly short-term pain.
Okay. Tugrul, let me put the same question to you in a different way. Do you think that this entire trade war has been worth it? Because now we're throwing into the mix, obviously, COVID-19, right, and the way that that has affected global economies anyhow. A lot of people are saying that the trade war could not have come at a worse time.
Yeah, actually, it's true from my perspective. As we can see, the U.S. economy is slowing down actually since 2018. I mean, if you look at the numbers in U.S. GDP growth will slow. It was in 2019 it was 2.2. This year is around 2%. It will be the 1.9. Next year, and this is the worst time basically that we can see this trade war between United States and China. But at the same time, United States cannot avoid this clash actually, because US is a declining power in this context. That's why they need to put this economic war into the political realm. That's why we are seeing, last few weeks blaming the China. But U.S. economy has been in crisis since the early 1980s. That we should not forget. Actually, manufacturing moved out from the United States in the early 1980s, not to China but other countries. But this trade war between China and the United States will give another dimension or opportunity for the global South or the third world countries. Basically, they can get a certain number of the U.S. companies moving out to China, maybe moving into Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Vietnam, that the United States has been using against China basically for investment purposes. Yeah. I mean, in next few decades, we will see this war as a kind of new Cold War, actually, not just a trade war.
Okay, so let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Huiyao Wang, who is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. He's also the counselor for the China State Council and vice chairman for the China Association for International Economic Cooperation at the Ministry of Commerce. Huiyao, thank you very much for your time today, for joining us from Beijing. What do you make of the trade war at this time? Of course, we have the numbers coming out of the U.S., and they're not looking very good for U.S. companies. Certainly, of course, we cannot deny that China's economy has been affected by this trade war as well. Will all of this be worth it, do you think, for the Trump administration?
Yes, thank you for the interview. Actually, I don't think so. I think that the U.S. is really suffer quite heavily. I mean, the number that you just mentioned it's really true. I think all the U.S. multinationals suffered, and also that U.S. actually the trade to China, the statistic from the first quarter, and also has greatly dropped U.S. exports to China. And also you can see that the U.S. is not gaining since the trade war, and the U.S. actually is losing. On the other hand, U.S. company has such big profile and exposure in China. There's auto giant like GM and Ford sells more cars in the United States than in China than in the United States. China is Apple's the largest international market. And also the Polycom sells 65% of its business to China. So you see all those U.S. companies getting affected. U.S. also sell China buys one third of the chips made by the U.S. companies. So this is really, I think it's kind of like you started the trade war, but actually you didn't get really the benefit, and actually you end up losing more and losing the market, losing the market share, losing the competitive edge to the other European, Japanese, other companies. Yeah. So I think it's really not really good. Of course, China didn't benefit either, but I think on balance, China certainly suffered less than the United States.
Okay, so Don, let me then ask you, do you think that, as I put to Tugrul earlier as well, that the Trump administration, that the U.S. should reconsider some of these policies that it's put in place because of the COVID-19 pandemic? Of course, and I imagine no one could see, of course, this pandemic coming from afar, and that, I would imagine, and one would hope that the Trump administration would have reconsidered possibly the trade war if they had known the pandemic was coming, because this just adds another obstacle to the mix for the U.S. economy to also recover from this, doesn't it?
Certainly. From the perspective of the tariffs and the Trump administration underneath the coronavirus pandemic, we know that U.S. companies during the outbreak, so in the last couple of months, they had been pleading with the U.S. administration to at least relax some of the tariffs on PPE goods coming in from China into the U.S. And I do believe that some of these tariffs were loosened, were diminished to a degree, so that we could import some of these goods, which are necessary for frontline workers in hospitals and medical healthcare staff professionals. So that was you could call that a small win. And I'm certain that within U.S.-China relations, as the bilateral relationship has deteriorated so rapidly and so quickly, that we can take any win that we possibly can. So I don't know if that's really made the headlines or not, but that's been something that's at least significant. That said, the Trump administration would not have budged, and they did not budge on loosening or relaxing any of the other tariffs, even while the coronavirus pandemic wrecks the global economy and definitely, absolutely starts to disintegrate the U.S. economic growth. Although we're starting to see some growth come back as states start to reopen. But nonetheless, the Trump administration will not budge on that. They want to keep the tariffs in place. Phase 1 deal that was signed in January is still in place. Yeah. So there will be no raising of the tariffs again, for now at least, of course, and we hope that will be the case. Now, regarding whether there's going to be any more relaxing of tariffs with the coronavirus, I don't think the Trump administration is going to do it in an election year. He'll look potentially soft, perhaps, to the electorate in the U.S. So for now, it won't be any relaxing or loosening of tariffs for the time being, but we will see in 2021.
Okay, so Tugrul, do you think that for now, at least, as Don there has laid out, because of the phase 1 of the trade deal, that we've seen the worst of it for the moment, at least, till the next year? Because I would think that both the Chinese government and the American government just want some room to breathe to be able to work things through right now because of the pandemic as well?
I don't think so. I think many people, they have a misperception about American politics, especially people in China. I don't think some people, they are able to understand what's happening in Washington, D.C. Let's not forget that U.S.-China policy or trade policy or this conflict between China and the United States actually has nothing to do with Trump. It comes from the establishment in D.C., whether Democrats or Republicans, especially from the security organizations and agencies. This is a new kind of Cold War is coming. We haven't seen the wars actually. Wars are coming because next 2 years, let's not forget, next 2 years, transportation and tourism industry will fight to survive under these economic circumstances. Remember this, in 1950s, only 25 million people were traveling between the countries. Today, this number is 1.4 billion people. And next 2 years, we will see the crisis in these industries. So this is directly related with what the United States has been trying to do actually against China. Containment of the China policy has started. So we see this in the trade deal. We see the Xinjiang human rights bill or Hong Kong human rights bill. This was developed in the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. But Trump is the right president to convince the war against China. It was very similar to George W. Bush in 2004 invading the Iraq. Actually, invasion of the Iraq was planned in the late 1980s and early 1990s by the American administration. And Bush was the right person in 2004. That's why Iraq was occupied by the United States. Same way with the China actually. The U.S.-China policy was developed under the Obama administration. It is practiced the Trump administration. It will continue to be practiced next few decades actually.
Okay, so Huiyao, tell us then from the Chinese perspective, do you think China is well placed to protect its own interests if things are about to get worse, both economically and politically, i.e. diplomatically, between the U.S. and China? Can China safeguard its own interests through this?
I think China probably will do because it's really now this pandemic has demonstrated such a strong capacity. China has been minimized the pandemic. One of the earliest to raise up the production. China is now almost two sections have opened.
Huiyao, I apologize. I'm going to interrupt you. There's some echoes in your voice. I'm just going to go to Don. We'll try to reconnect you if we can. Don, let me ask you then, from your connections on the ground there, Don, in China, I know you've spent some time in Hong Kong and otherwise, do you think that the country is well placed to protect its own interests? Because certainly it is, of course, a mammoth economic power in the world as well. It can also wield its own arms in this war, can't it?
Certainly, when you have a market of 1.4 billion, U.S. companies are not going to just shy away from that, nor will, despite the fact that tariffs in place, will the majority of them want to move out. That said, we do see that because of the tariffs in place, because of the market uncertainty in China domestically as well, although the phase 1 deal has helped to stabilize that, we do see that some U.S. companies are hedging their bets and they are moving some of their manufacturing or some of their operation or some part of their supply chain to other countries, including India or Mexico. So nonetheless, though, when I've looked at surveys from leading trade associations or businesses that, nonprofits that represent American businesses in China, the big takeaway that I gather or summarize from this is that 2019 profits and revenues were up for U.S. companies operating in China, but optimism was down. So, and another thing that I would take away is U.S. companies, while things right now don't look so great, the majority of them will stick around in China because of a growing middle class and a consumerism culture that's really been just budding in China for the last 2 decades or so. So they're not really going to go in just a wholesale kind of way out of China, but you do see some companies hedging their bets, but the most will probably stick it out because they want access to that big consumer market in China. So that would be China's, you could say, the tool that you were just mentioning that they would wield. It's that market access, essentially.
What are your thoughts then about what kind of instability we're all in for, right? Because these are two huge economies, and even through the pandemic, if they weaken, then the rest of our economies, of course, weaken around the world because we're all in a globalized system, right? And then, of course, added to that are the political differences between these two countries, even on foreign policies, right? So in key places around the world, we know that the U.S. and China differ on how to approach different situations, be it in the Middle East or otherwise, even if it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, for example, or many such other scenarios. Will those sorts of confrontations also increase parallel to the trade war and parallel to the Trump administration adding pressure on whatever political events may be happening within China?
Yeah, I think so. I think there will be long negotiations between United States and United States and other countries, and China and other countries. For example, in the Turkish case or Israeli case, China's relationship with these countries, Israel and Turkey, are very different. But at the same time, U.S. is negotiating with Israel and Turkey on China. Not to get closer to China, not to to have a trade relation, political relation, military relation with China. I think United States will put more pressure on other countries as well around the world. As we can see this very clearly in 2 days ago, White House joint statement criticizing the China on human rights issues, especially related with Hong Kong. These Five Eyes countries, except New Zealand, have a joint statement 2 days ago. United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia, that we can see this. But we will see this struggle between China and the United States in the third world or global south or developing countries, I think, in all over the world. Maybe some regional countries, regional powers, small powers, basically, they might be benefit from this, especially Turkey, maybe India, Pakistan is another one, Indonesia is another one, in South America, Brazil and Argentina, there are large populations and regionally influential countries, including Nigeria in Africa, Algeria in the North Africa, Egypt is another one. But we will see. We are moving towards the Pandora box, actually.
All right, let me try to give the final word to you, Huiyao, if you can hear me there in Beijing. What are your final thoughts about what we are in for in the coming days, months, or even years? As I mentioned to Tugrul, and we've spoken about and we understand, of course, China and the U.S. differ on a lot around the world when it comes to different scenarios, different wars, etc. Will all of that also increase alongside the trade war?
Well, I think that this post-pandemic world pattern will certainly differ based on what the U.S. is trying to push. U.S. just created the WHO, and U.S. is threatening to create WTO and many other organizations. And what you have actually witnessed is that how quickly and swiftly China has actually contained the virus. China is the first country to back to normal, to put the reduction. China now is the largest trading nation with 120 countries in the world. China will be really be the future, the backbone of global economy. I don't think anybody can write off China. And also people will realize, that even the U.S. trade war, now you can see this new report, is 1.7 trillion loss of U.S. companies on their values. It's precisely that due to the trade war with China. So people will realize that if you have to do business with China, you have to economically engage China, then you're getting prosperous society. So after post-pandemic, with this global recession, we push all the countries to work more with China, not on the contrary. I think China will be doing fine. I mean, China is so effective. China is going to lift all the extreme poverty by the end of this year. China has already lifted 800 million people out of poverty. So you can see how the central government the government implementation power and also the whole society is really effective. I think that part of China will be really a good, the backbone to the global economy and to the global governance in support of WHO and WTO and all the rest. So I think China will work with every country together in the future.
Okay, we'll leave those our final word, but we had, of course, Huiyao speaking to us there from Beijing, Don speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and Tugrul sharing his insights there from Istanbul. We appreciate, of course, their expertise and for sharing their thoughts with us. We've tried to give you the range of this, haven't we, where, of course, we know both countries have been affected. Their economies have been affected because of this trade war, even before going into this pandemic. But this pandemic has now just made things a lot worse. So the projections that we are currently seeing may very well get much worse. Right now, we've seen the projections from the New York Fed, but those projections may very well get very bad for the rest of this year as well. As we've seen right now, the numbers are still quite negative. And even for the Chinese, things may get worse because, again, it just makes sense, right? We're in a globalized world. These are two huge economies which are very interdependent within this globalized world. And trade between the two countries is, of course, very high, even though there are tariffs now on many items. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, I'm going to discuss the UK and the situation there vis-a-vis the coronavirus pandemic. And we're going to hone in on a recent survey done by the Royal College of Nursing. It surveyed about 5,000 workers, specifically, of course, health workers. And again, within the context of how they're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and whether or not they have access to the protective equipment that they need to be able to do their jobs properly. And a disturbing, of course, numbers have now come out that about 700 or so of those who have surveyed were for the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic community known as BAME. Those nurses said that they are more likely to have had problems to access the kind of protective equipment they need, be it the proper attire of protective gear from head to toe, or just gloves, aprons, etc. So in some way or the other, it seems that these BAME community nurses or healthcare workers of some form or the other are at a disadvantage almost. And that almost parallels a bit with what's happening in the U.S., where we know that in many of those African-American communities especially, the hospitals there are less equipped than the other hospitals in other parts of the country. I don't want to make an exact comparison because, of course, the context of each country is different. So I want to understand, of course, the UK context to all of this and then bring in our guest to discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Tetteh Kofi, who is a broadcaster and journalist. He has also been a consultant to corporate institutions on the management of diversity. He's joining us from London. Also joining us from the British capital is Ahmed Uddin, who is senior manager, I should say, at Islamic Human Rights Commission. And finally, we're also joined from Essex by Umar, Kankiya, who is a youth and communication specialist. He's been a former mental health lawyer and having practiced law for the last 10 years. Umar, Ahmed, and Tetteh, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Ahmed, let me start with you. What do you make of this survey? What do you make of its results in that BAME communities are, again, proven to be at a disadvantage through this pandemic in the UK?
Thank you for having me. So when it comes to the BAME community in the UK in relation to COVID-19, we are kind of disadvantaged on a number of different fronts. So you've mentioned the NHS staff members who aren't getting access to various protective equipment. So if you look at the NHS staff members at the moment, 1 in 5 is employed by 1 in 5 employed in the NHS is of a non-white background. There's been reports of widespread bullying and also widespread a number of difficult shifts been given to people from the BAME background. On top of that, if you're not giving protective equipment to individuals from BAME community, then you are exposing them to a high level of vulnerability. This is added on top of the fact that that research has shown that most the people who are most vulnerable to the virus itself are people from the BAME community. So we are more likely to get the virus three times more likely than our white counterparts in Britain.
Okay, so then Tetteh, is it, again, just like what we discussed about in the US, is this because this community is from the get-go at a socio-economic disadvantage?
I mean, you would have to say so, because whereas actually my statistic for the minority ethnics who work within the National Health Service puts them at 44%, the mortality rate has been something like 70%. And the question you have to ask is why? Now, the fact is that at the front line or operational levels, BAME staff are always far more exposed. And at the front line level, of course, you don't have administrative and executive authority to decide who gets rostered for which duty at what time and under what conditions. So typically speaking, when you get to the levels of management, it is white managers who are making these calls. And I have lots of anecdotal evidence from people who work within the health service that actually all the tough calls fall on the black and minority ethnic staff. Now, it would be okay if they could find the voice to reject these things. But the truth is, they don't have the authority, either socially or professionally, to prevail upon their bosses to give them what effectively would be a fair shake. So basically, I mean, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. They don't get a choice in whether or not they get the PPE. They don't get a choice in whether or not they are exposed. And so the mortality rate from COVID within the National Health Service will naturally reflect the risks they are being made to take and which they can't seem to resist.
Umar, then I'm trying to understand that. Why this BAME staff that knows that it's at a disadvantage right now when it comes to accessing PPE, why haven't they been more vocal, or have they been vocal and have they just been stopped, as Tetteh there said? I mean, in the sense that they don't have an outlet where to complain and where to actually have their voices heard, because you would think that because so much of NHS staff is BAME, that they would be able to almost unite and almost create enough chaos to ensure that they're protected?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different reasons as to why this would be the case. I mean, statistically speaking, you're more likely to find BAME people being bank staff in the NHS as well. So there's that fear of not wanting to rock the boat too much to avoid not being able to get shift work, subsequently being able to assist at home. There are organisations within the NHS, and I do think and I do believe that, this matter is being raised more and more on a wider level. And I think we have to also look at the fact that, statistically, the government are fully aware that BAME, for black people especially, 4 times more likely to die if they are to contract COVID-19. It goes down to like 1.5 times likely, in the South Asian community. So there's definitely knowledge of this, and with the fact that the government are now looking to start easing lockdown quite significantly in the UK, starting from this Monday, with introducing 6 people being able to attend another person's private garden, etc., and trying to get more people back to work, there needs to be urgent discussions and decisions made about how they're going to handle the situation, because BAME people make up a large degree of the workforce here in the UK. And I think we have to take this matter really, really seriously, and the government needs to take action on this as soon as possible, especially the fact that we have BAME people that are working in the front line, doing a lot of the jobs that other people don't want to do. And these issues of not having the protective equipment is vital. And, it literally is becoming a matter of life and death, and it needs to be addressed.
Indeed. So do you think then that the UK, as in the nation itself, Britons themselves, have realized how important BAME communities are for them, be it through the NHS or otherwise? Because there seems to be ever so slowly, I mean, at least from what I've observed when it comes to the BBC and Sky News and others, that there seems to be this slow admission that, okay, BAME staff in the NHS are really actually important. They're actually, you know, providing extremely important service for the rest of the country at this time. Does that then mean this will translate into real world changes on the ground within those communities?
I highly doubt that's going to be the case. The BAME community has been at the forefront of building this nation for decades. If you look in when the mass migration of BAME community came to the UK after the World War II, we have been part and parcel of every section of society. And time again, we are seen to be, and as outsiders, as aliens, taking away our white counterparts' jobs. Many polls are showing that, for example, in the Muslim community, we're the most charitable community, yet the level of Islamophobia that's prevailing within society is on the rise, and to the point that mainstream political parties have taken on the rhetoric of the far right. And we are seeing institutional Islamophobia on the rise as well. It's always been there. It's just that they are more vocal about it. So unfortunately, I know this is very kind of pessimistic. I don't think things will change. People have been clapping for the NHS staff members every week, but a lot of BAME members of the community are saying, well, you can clap as you want, but NHS staff members from the BAME community are facing racism in hospitals right at this moment whilst they're risking their lives.
And then, Tetteh, you know, this then brings me to the context of the UK, right? So even before the pandemic hit the country, we had Brexit, right? And the entire context that that brought vis-a-vis racism that came to the fore during the Brexit campaign and after. And, you know, of course, what exactly happens to the UK going forward vis-a-vis its relations within its minority communities of various sorts, be they Europeans or otherwise. Do you think that all of this, again, as I had put to our earlier guest about how there's this realization almost on the part of some Britons that BAME are actually really important members of society, do you think that that will actually bring, you know, to the fore some changes of some sort, or am I being too optimistic?
Well, I don't want to say I'm pessimistic. I'd like to think I'm being realistic. But whenever unpleasant figures about the BAME community surface and people want to drill down and understand, say, why me, for example, as a black man, I'm twice as likely to die of COVID as a white person, when everything else is taken out, including comorbidities, age, demographics, and so on and so forth. I'm still twice as likely as a white person. This affects the country very badly. And mostly, the country is more interested in covering its shame and guilt than solving the problem. The impression as an observer and as a professional in the field of managing diversity in the United Kingdom for a long time is that our society far more hates being called racist than it hates racism itself. So when it comes down to the actual actions that are required to fight these unequal trends, it is the onus, the responsibility of leadership to send the signals. And the only conclusion a kind of an objective observer would arrive at is that actually within the culture and the fabric, certainly of the NHS, black lives are worth less. It's as simple as that. Now, once you send that signal from the top, you don't have to scream it out. But in the way you roster people, in the way you promote them, in the way you recruit them, in the way you expose them to danger, you send a signal that there is a totem pole of worth. And if these people are at the bottom of that totem pole, the consequences will just follow. So that is the most important thing now for the leaders to do. They must send a signal that we recognize this. But I'm not sure they're ready to do that yet.
You know, it's interesting, isn't it, Omar? In the U.S., we've had, you know, in the U.K., and right now we do have members of the BAME community who are in cabinet positions, right? So when one looks at the cabinet of even Boris Johnson, who you wouldn't expect to really be that close to BAME community members, considering his rhetoric in the past, but nevertheless, he has members of the BAME community in his cabinet, be it Priti Patel or whoever. We can probably list on quite a few names. Why doesn't that, do you think, give enough confidence to the rest of us that BAME communities are doing okay for themselves in the country?
I think we should be quite clear that, Boris Johnson has members of the South Asian community in his cabinet. He has, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, I believe there's one, or I think there's two members who attend cabinet, but they're not actually secretaries of state. So there is still that inequality that exists there anyway. So, I think there is definitely a clear difference between how South Asians are viewed in the UK and also how black people are viewed in the UK. And I think that's why you see that level of, that discrepancy even at the highest levels possible. Speaking as somebody who used this in law, that was very in the legal world as well. You'll find more South Asians who are partners, who are judges, who are more senior in their firms, and you will find black people. So I think there's definitely a discrepancy that is going on there. Probably, I think, and this is just my own personal theory, but I think there's still lots of issues in terms of the black diaspora here in the UK because, that encompasses so many different elements, Caribbean countries, and there's so many Caribbean countries, there's so many African countries, and there's so many different cultures and identities that, have not meshed completely together. So it's a bit more difficult to have that kind of collective voice in a lot of these institutions, whereas I think South Asians have managed to hone that and kind of frame that quite well over the years. So I think, for me, personally speaking, I think, a lot more needs to be done, a lot more needs to be kind of tackled, especially I think with the black community in terms of addressing a lot of these inequalities that are happening across the board. And I think, bringing it back to the issue around, obviously, with PPE and with Brexit, and I think what Tetteh was saying just about the fact that people hate to be called racist. I've had incidents where I've called people racist and they absolutely hate that, even though that's how they're behaving. So therefore, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. It's important that we are going into these professions and we're point blank saying to them, this is how we feel. There is institutional racism that still exists in this institution. Yeah. Let's talk about it. Let's not hide away from that. Let's talk about it. And once it's all out in the open, then we can start having the proper dialogue as to how we're going to address that. But I think until we get to the point where people are actually actively calling it out and saying what it is, then that, the issues are just going to continue and they'll continue to get buried.
Okay, Ahmed, I'll give you the final word. I'm just going to, throw out a name there, Diane Abbott, right? And the way she was treated while she was Shadow Secretary during the Corbyn years. The very open racism sometimes against her, at least online and otherwise. I wonder if that is still indicative of what our other two guests were talking about, the fact that the black community in the UK really still very much is at a disadvantage, even when it comes to representation within politicians and how, if they are even there, the respect that they're given.
Yes, and we do need to have, as my colleague here kind of mentioned, we need to have honest conversations about the levels of institutional racism that's prevalent in society. If you look at the areas where the black community is residing, it's not well funded, and as a result, the schools are not well funded. As a result, there's high levels of child poverty, and as a result, there's more people who are unemployed. If you look at the stats in relation to COVID-19 lockdown, black African and Caribbean men are 50% more likely to be in shutdown sectors. That's indicative of where the black community is. So they're fighting against many different layers of disadvantage, and we need to have honest conversations. And the politicians need to start listening to the voice from the BAME community, especially the black and African communities.
Very well. We'll leave those a final word, but we appreciate all three of our guests for joining us today and for giving us their insight on this issue. That was Tetteh speaking to us from London. Ahmed was also speaking to us from the British capital, and Umar was joining us there from Essex, also in the UK. Viewers, we try to give you, as much of a widespread view on exactly what's happening there within BAME communities in the UK, vis-a-vis, of course, their lack of access to protective equipment in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which many of these NHS staffers are dealing with at this time. A lot of them, as you well know, are members of the BAME community at this time. But then, of course, we also have the stats of those who are affected by COVID-19, i.e. those who get sick of that from that virus. And those within the BAME community statistically are more likely to die, especially those of the Black community. And again, that goes back to many issues which we've spoken about when it comes to the U.S., socioeconomic disadvantages, which has been growing and has been something that's been generational almost, really, if you can argue it out that way. And of course, then it's about representation in government, representation vis-a-vis those who are in high positions within the NHS or in other such important organizations throughout the country. The institutional racism is something which these countries are still very much dealing with and haven't been able to really get ahead of at this time. We'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.